2, 3. okay? It's like, you turn it on.
I know.
Oh, sorry. All right. That's exciting. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us back. I hope that you are enjoying the magic of Disney, as well as the good food that the hotel has. So I think it's been going well. It's always nice to see so many familiar faces, people that we have gotten to know through our ASCE kind of community, and it's wonderful to be here. I know that after, and we have heard it several times during the convention, after 2+ years, it's so good to be next to each other, to be able to break bread and to catch up. And so we are glad that we are doing it in this place, as Maria sung, a magical place. So good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for being here. My name is Feniosky Peña-Mora. I'm the chair of the Industry Leaders Council for ASCE, and I have the pleasure today to be the moderator of this panel. I think we have heard a couple of times the concept of rock star, and we definitely have a rock star panel, so we are continuing with the lineup. And as you can imagine, there have been a lot of conversations. We heard yesterday in the opening from the White House infrastructure coordinator, as well as we heard from Secretary Keogh from Arkansas. We heard from the infrastructure coordinator, Hanson from Utah, and we heard from Director Pestrella here from LA County. And they all were discussing the need to see this investment, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, as an investment in the future, but not forgetting the past. And what do we mean by not forgetting the past? Making sure that the decisions that were made in the past that may not have been the best, looking at it from today's lenses, and maybe at that time lenses, because of how affected some communities, how it divided the pain, or that means the hassle, of a construction of an infrastructure project, and the benefits that were derived from the investment in that infrastructure. And sometimes those two communities were different. The one that more or less paid the price in terms of their communities were separated, and the others that were able to take advantage of the benefits, the convenience of those investments. And I think that was a theme that was emphasized over and over, and we heard it yesterday very loud and clear. However, we also have heard, and as I was chairing the strategic planning committee that you heard that we just passed as a board of direction on Saturday, I did hear quite a bit of what does equity means in infrastructure? What does engineering has to do with equity? What do we, civil engineering, has to do with equity? And those are very good questions, because sometimes when there is not a good definition, we are all very good in filling in the blanks, and we will fill it according to our experiences, our understanding, and our view of the world. But I think today, what we hope is that we get a little bit more standardization of that definition from the perspective of the speakers that we have here today. And we know all about standards, okay? So in that case, I think we can relate to that concept very well. And particularly, as we have seen that in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, I just learned that, in Washington, they call the three uncles. Bill, that's the bipartisan infrastructure bill, law. Then you have CHIP, the CHIPS and law. And then you have, I think they call it IRA, because they don't like the Inflation Reduction Act. They call it Uncle IRA. So we are going to be talking today about Uncle Bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law. And one of those big components, and actually it's throughout all the three uncles, the three laws, is the Justice 40, the commitment to spend 40% of the federal dollars in the communities that have been traditionally disadvantaged. And we heard yesterday, I think Director Pastrella kind of emphasizes, that sometimes the concept of disadvantaged communities tend to be kind of connected to racial lines, but not necessarily. There are a lot of disadvantaged communities that are in very rural areas that have not received the adequate infrastructure that we believe is important, and that is to define the quality of life. And these communities can be of any race, of any color. And I think the concept here is, how do we ensure that the investment that we have now in front of us are made in a way that benefits all, that we do the right project, that we do it the right way, that we do it with the right people, that we do it for all. And I think that's what we would like to talk today and share with you from the experience of this panel in working through those issues. Not today, not last year. You can see that the experience that we're talking here, experience that have been there and built over the years, really trying to ensure that disadvantaged communities get their fair share, that investment benefit all. And so I would like to start by first make a particular acknowledgement, because we have to acknowledge that even where we are today, it is the land that was the home and the traditional land belonging to the Tonga Nation of California. We have to respect and be grateful for the Tonga people who still consider themselves the caretakers of this land. It is through their examples that we are reminded for a greater responsibility to take care of Earth and each other. And that resonates with all of us. When we talk, and we have heard over and over the word resiliency, which is, I think, very familiar for all of us as civil engineers. Sustainability. How do we ensure that whatever use of resources we are doing today are done taking consideration the legacy that we leave for the future, and then we leave a better future. And that's a concept that we are getting very familiar. But today, we're going to look at the third voice that we have been speaking in this conference, equity. Equity in the investments that we make today. So, for that discussion, I would like to tell you that there should be some cue cards in your table. Please, as the speaker are speaking and you have a comment or a question, please take a note and just raise it very delicately so that one of the ASCE staff will take that note and share it with me so that I can ask that question to the panel. So all of you have it on your table, so please just make use of that. And we would like to make it as engaging as possible, but with this format, and I hope that you are okay. So first, let me introduce the first panelist, Dr. D'Artagnan Scorza. Dr. Scorza is the inaugural Executive Director of Racial Equality for Los Angeles County. He oversees anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion initiatives within the county, which is home to 10 million people. Dr. Scorza launched programs that help youth of color become social justice leaders and college graduates. He passed policies that prioritize over $160 million for student services across all the UC campuses, and secure over $350 million to support K-12 school construction. Somebody that has dedicated his life to education and to build the future of this nation. Dr. Scorza earned his Ph.D. in education from UCLA. He's an U.S. Navy Iraq War veteran. Our thanks, Dr. Scorza, for your service to our nation. Definitely something that we really need. Thank you. Thank you. He's a native of Inglewood, California. Dr. Scorza, we're going to give you the floor for some remarks.
Great. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, we got to wake up back there. Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's a Tuesday at 2 o'clock, and you're all tired after lunch and been sitting in panels and conferences all day. So I hope we're going to have a good time today. And I really want you to think about the questions you want to ask. We're going to get into a conversation today about racial equity, and thank you, Dr. Peña, for recognizing and acknowledging the first peoples of this ancestral and unceded territory, the land that we call Los Angeles. We recognize the Tongva, the Chumash, and the Tataviam as the original peoples of this land, and as those whom we must continue to lift up along with their culture and their stories. So today I'm going to talk about racial equity, but I'm going to talk about this in the context of the work that you all do. And what I really want to acknowledge is that there are institutional milestones that we must achieve in our lives in order to be successful. And that often those milestones are influenced by the ecological and contextual factors, the environments, the families, the neighborhoods, the schools, the systems that touch our lives. And all of that shapes outcomes that we experience. Meaning the institutionally defined milestones, graduating from high school, getting into college, getting a good job, becoming a homeowner, all of those things are shaped by your environment and by your context, and your choices are located within the context of that environment. We also know that environments shape not only your life outcomes, but they interfere with your choice. So neighborhood structural characteristics, being able to access good schools or the lack of good schools, or for example, institutions that may make decisions on where they're going to build certain projects or not build those projects, for example, grocery stores or local roads or bridges or water projects, can all shape the community's collective efficacy and shape whether or not there's social support and stability in that neighborhood. So one of the things that we talk about here in LA County is this concept of structural racism. Now, I'm not just talking about people's attitudes and their beliefs. We're talking about the ways in which people make decisions, either institutionally, through public and private organizations, relationally, or spatially. What do I mean by that? I mean, for example, let's say you're in a neighborhood like I grew up in Inglewood, where there are over 140 liquor stores and 120 fast food restaurants. We lack adequate access to fresh fruits and veggies. If there is a store, an organization like, take, for example, Trader Joe's, who may have a policy of not putting a grocery store in a community where the average median income is below $60,000 in some cases, or $100,000 in others, the decision of Trader Joe's to not put that store in Inglewood means that there's a lack of access to fresh fruits and veggies, for example, in that community or in that neighborhood. So of course people are going to make decisions that are based upon their need to survive or based upon their need to thrive. And if they only have access to liquor stores or fast food restaurants, then obviously that's going to affect their choices, right? You can't choose to access good food if it doesn't exist. You can't choose to make decisions that are going to improve your long-term life outcomes or go to college, for example, if you don't have college counselors. Your structural characteristics, your neighborhood environment shapes your life choices. Or if, for example, many of us got here and are sitting in this room today because we have great relationships. Somebody mentored us. We had a colleague we were able to build, reach out to and have get a reference from, right? You had somebody to help you navigate and get to this space. Your access to relationships also shape your life outcomes. And then the places you live, the physical location, the geography, the lack of green space, the lack of tree canopy, living in a community where you face urban heat island effect, all of these things contribute to what we call a structural racism, i.e. the ways in which people in positions of power use those positions to either influence outcomes that others experience or may limit their ability to be self-determined. It reinforces itself in the ways in which we make decisions in our institutions in connection to people and relationships and others. Now, I'm going to briefly go through this, but we see it show up through things like opportunity hoarding or forms of exclusion. We see it show up in the ways in which certain communities or individuals are exploited or even controlled, and you see some examples on here as well. Predatory lending practices, for example, may be a form of exploitation that led to the housing crisis we experienced in 2008, which then made it possible for organizations like Colony Starwood and Tricon and others to move into my community in Inglewood and buy up a lot of the neighborhoods, making it almost impossible for people who grew up in those neighborhoods to come back and purchase homes. So why do we talk about equity? We talk about equity because it's about understanding that each individual is starting from a different place, right? That we're not all running the same race and the same speed and the same way with the same shoes, with the same equipment. We're all starting from different places, and what equity acknowledges is the need for justice. It recognizes that differences matter and that systems must be balanced to distribute resources and opportunities needed to reach equal outcomes. It's ultimately not ceding the ground to equality. We need to achieve equality in our society, but you can't get to equality without equity. Because if you start with equality as a standard, meaning you treat everybody the same, expect them to take advantage of the same opportunities, but they're starting from different places, different schools, different conditions, different neighborhood structural characteristics, it's almost impossible to get to equality. Or you have to run 2 to 3 times as fast to get there. So in the County of Los Angeles, we've taken on a policy to advance what we call as anti-racism. Anti-racism is the active process. It's about being proactive. It's about not waiting for something to happen, but instead we're examining our current policies, systems, and practices so that we redistribute power and resources equitably so that communities that are living in conditions of concentrated and accumulated disadvantage or historical disadvantage can thrive over time. And we do that. Why? Because the very land that you're in, here in Los Angeles County, and not too far from this neighborhood or these communities, had many policies that led to an equitable distribution of resources. For example, broken treaties with Native American tribes. We have one of the largest Native American Indian populations, urban populations in the US. Why? Because the federal government had a policy in the 50s and 60s to transfer Native Americans from their reservations in Utah and Denver and Colorado and Nevada to places like Los Angeles and Chicago and others with the promise of jobs and homes that never materialized for many of our Native American and American Indian populations. You also see wide-ranging efforts that were led by the real estate industry with regards to where home loans were made available under the Federal Housing Administration by support of through the analysis or through redlining from the Homeowner Loan Corporation. And here in Los Angeles County, you can see our redlining and yellow lining map, where certain communities were denied access to wealth building opportunities and our home loan opportunities. These communities that you see, red and yellow, are often the communities that lack infrastructure. They lack projects, they lack green space, they lack decent roads, they lack access to high quality schools, they lack a decent tax base to pay for some of those infrastructure and some of that infrastructure and some of those institutions. If you look at our redlining maps today and you go to our county website under ceo.lacounty.gov/recovery and you look at a tool that we created in my office called the Equity Explorer, you will see that neighborhoods of concentrated and accumulated disadvantage match nearly almost identically to these historically redlined communities that occurred back in the 30s and the 40s. There are also things like racially restricted covenants. The focus on segregation is what drove many of these divisions in resources. So when we looked at our institutions and organizations that made these decisions in LA County and many counties around the country, many cities around the country, they did so on the basis of making sure that certain communities were excluded from opportunities, excluded from the ability to build wealth, as well as generate income within their own communities. You add to that legal dispossession policies, for example, the Japanese internment, again, racially restricted covenants, and a whole series of policies that ultimately have affected the neighborhood structural characteristics, or again, built environment that we see today. So when we think about Justice 40 and we think about these policies, we have to think about them in the context of the many decisions that have led to what we define as being structural racism. And if you would like to learn more, you don't have to take my word for it. Go ahead and take out your phone, pull up the QR code that you see on the screen here, and you can check out all kinds of examples. I'm sure you have examples in your own communities and neighborhoods as well. So we think about this in terms of an infrastructure because we know that infrastructure investments are built to last. And in many ways, there are a lot of errors that were made over time where industrial locations were cited. For example, Jordan High School in Watts, where my family is from, had a contaminated recycling plant next door to a high school that leaked lead in the water. So students for almost 60 years had lead in their water rights. So there are planning decisions, policy decisions that were made that have had an effect upon people. But the good thing about equity is that it's typically cheaper. So the long-term cost, for example, of building a sidewalk in a neighborhood that lacks access to roads helps to improve health outcomes, improve transportation infrastructure in that neighborhood, and connects people to work, to schools, makes it walkable, makes that neighborhood walkable, et cetera, as well. So thinking about the role that equity can play, for example, advancing electric vehicle chargers in communities where people typically lack access to EVs, helps to increase the sustainability in that neighborhood, but also decrease pollution and the hazards associated with it. So I'll be quick and I'm going to fly through some of this. So LA County has focused on the central pillars that help us improve equity, meaning we recognize that race, place, and gender matter, that we want to change our systems and our environments. We want to build resilience and promote healing. We want to take an intergenerational approach and then take a cross-sector, cross-systems, and cross-life stage approach. And all of these factors help us focus on equity. You look, for example, at Milwaukee and what they were able to do in thinking about how opportunity was shaped in relationship to place and the people that were there. They took advantage of and recognized the importance of providing access to resources in communities, for example, quality housing, or paying attention to things like alcohol outlet density, or neighborhood characteristics that led to increased forms of violence and or crime, and then began to build their infrastructure in a way that helped to decrease some of the negative outcomes that they were seeing in their neighborhoods. Here in LA County, our board has taken an incredible they've done an incredible amount of work to weave much of what we're doing around infrastructure together between shutting down some of our oil pumping stations, addressing our tree canopy, thinking about how we can establish a land bank, making sure that we pay attention to our sustainable outcomes and sustainable development, as well as leveraging our American Rescue Plan Act dollars. You heard earlier about the other bills that are being passed, for example, bipartisan infrastructure law, and others to help strengthen our ability to advance infrastructure equity. And our board is also making sure that not only are we able to communicate these things effectively, but that we're working closely and in partnership with folk in our community. We've been able to, and we'll talk briefly about this later, but we've been able to map out the Justice 40 locations, as well as the projects that are being proposed throughout our regions, hundreds of projects that are being proposed throughout our region, to think about the benefits they're going to have upon communities as well as the burdens they might pose. And then finally, working closely with our Department of Public Works and under the leadership of Director Mark Pastrella, who has been an incredible indefatigable individual in our county. This Director Pastrella has helped to ensure that our Department of Public Works is targeting our resources in ways that benefit all Angelenos, but also ensures that those who are left behind get access to those resources. We've developed something called Vision Zero in LA County, and that enhances our ability to reduce, to increase traffic safety and reduce things like traffic fatalities. And so thinking about this comprehensively with regards to traffic sustainability, traffic safety, pedestrian safety, our sustainability work, our bipartisan infrastructure law, and Justice 40 has helped to guide our efforts here in LA County, and I would be more than happy to share more details with you all a bit later. We've now concluded with the slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Scorza. Really very interesting discussion of all the different issues from a historical perspective, but also from the great work that you're doing in LA County. So thank you for sharing that. Our next speaker is Harold Mitchell, Jr. He's the Executive Director of the Regenesis Community Development Corporation. The Regenesis project was founded in 1998 and is a national model for environmental justice with a focus on Spartanburg, South Carolina. Regenesis leveraged an initial $20,000 from the EPA to make it into over $300 million in private and public investment. You can imagine the power and the will to make that leap. The rehabilitation plan's accomplishments include the development of more than 500 affordable housing units, a healthcare system with 7 locations, transportation improvements, job training, and career opportunities for community residents, and much more. Harold is also a former state representative of South Carolina on the House District number 31. Harold?
Yes, sir. Thank you. First, I'd like to ask Dr. Scorza if I could move to California.
Yeah.
Being from South Carolina, it's kind of hard following that, sir. That was my wish list. But I would like to go back and score where I think this kind of fits in the conversation around Justice 40. Serving on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, one of the first things we did in the transition was look at the screening tool of California. A lot of the tools, a lot of best practices that have been used here. And in doing so, I kind of figured during the Obama administration, we saw a lot of the obstructionists and what I call spinally challenged members of the House and Senate that will not make decisions unless it's well, I won't go there, but they have trouble doing the right things. And looking at Justice 40 and what we've never had a president to make this kind of a commitment before in environmental justice and disadvantaged communities that have been overlooked and overburdened. So in looking at it, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, you know, it's not like you're talking about unfunded mandates to address issues that have been facing a lot of these impacted communities. But when you look, Dr. Scorza and you know, folks here in this room, I'm really happy to see the ASCE, this organization, step up and talk about equity the way you're doing, because you're where it's like the rubber hits the road with a lot of the permitting and issues where if someone doesn't say, no, you can't do, they're going to move forward with it. And what we often see is the impacts in the communities. And when you talk about equity, and has any of this worked in communities thus far besides California? Well, you look on the East Coast and the Southeast where we have issues with red state governors who refuse to even look at initiating these resources in these communities. It's a major problem, because if we talk about equity and fairness, we can look right now. All of the money that's out there right now in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed November 2021, and we're still talking about drinking water in Jackson, Mississippi, that's undrinkable. I know even here, one of the projects that we're working with in Allensworth, they have 150 parts per billion of arsenic in their drinking water. You look at Flint, Michigan, you still have the issues there. You go to Lowndes County, Alabama, you have hookworms, poor sewer systems. And this is not just one or two places. And as we stated some time ago, there's a Flint, Michigan in every state. But why is it that when resources and commitments are on the table to address these issues, that we're not seeing people connect the dots and bring in the civil engineers and a lot of the experts we have in this room to address? We're continually building new communities, neighborhoods, but it's kind of like we've forgotten those that are overburdened. I'd like to see what you've been able to do in LA County spread across the country, because I'm going around the country and we're constantly hearing people say, well, I don't know anything about Justice 40. What is Justice 40? Is there any resources behind the bipartisan infrastructure bill? And I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. And, after next week, what's going to happen with the midterms? There's a lot of questions that we see that, time is of the essence to create some tangible examples that other communities can use around the country. This is a perfect model. I can't wait to hear Lacey, but we need models for other communities, because those that we go into, we hear staffs constantly tell us, and I'm not going to call them out, but there are some major cities that were clueless. And we're working currently right now, taking the Regenesis model, the methodology with the Institute, the Regenesis Institute, with a team to go out and kind of walk a process that people on the ground, the communities, local government, not understanding how to connect the dots, because you have some rural governments that, they're not sitting around looking at grants.gov trying to figure out what's coming out, when to apply, and they need assistance. And these are some of the places that, we've been able to identify. And when you look at the screening tool that you have and the EJ screening tool, we have legacy sites, polluted sites, that it's hard to screen and put into an equation if it doesn't exist. Yeah. Where I grew up, the municipal landfill didn't even exist, according to the state. So how do you put that into a screening tool to look at health disparities and impacts? But this is where and why you need community engagement and community involvement. We were able to identify that. The city, under EPA oversight, did the cleanup. And right now, Duke Energy, the city, and Solvay Chemicals are actually using this as a proposed reuse for the solar farm that's going to pull Solvay Chemicals. They'll get their energy from this solar farm, reducing their carbon footprint, and for the life of the field, be able to give real tangible impacts for the community and their utilities. A lot of this is where we see sites, like say for instance down in Florida, we had another site there that according to the state, there's nothing wrong, but it was a former paper mill that the community was built on top of. Elevated levels of cyanide, poor infrastructure there. I mean, the least little drop of rain, there's the flooding there that occurs, but no one's addressing it. And they're sitting right less than 2 blocks from the Gulf, and you see homes around them that are going up, $1 million homes, where Hurricane Michael plowed through, but they're allowing them to rebuild not something up off the ground, but you're talking about slabs. Ian that came through last week, I was looking and it's like, oh my God, if Ian plows up and hits Northport St. Joe, what's going to happen to this community again? But, you know, even with they have the elevated levels of cyanide in their soils. So being able to look at, you know, the disparities and the health department talking about the issues and the health impacts in that community, they're not connecting those dots that we see of the impacts. So this is one thing that I'm hopeful now that the resources are on the table, that we can start connecting the dots from the problems to the solutions, and being able to bring in people like ASCE to help with a lot of the local governments and people that are not just going to do the right thing. Trust me, come over to the East Coast down in the Southeast, and I know there are probably some of you folks in here that are saying, please don't call my state. But we have major issues and challenges, and I'm not going to prolong because I really want to get into the discussion and hear from this group here, because it's not about talking about some of the things that we've been able to do there, but it's like, how do we take advantage of this time, move this forward, replicate and scale up what's happened here in a couple of other spots that are doing the right things? Because right now, what we're seeing on the WEJAC, the White House Council, is we're so far behind, and I'm just afraid in the next 2 weeks what may happen and roll back to the problems that we are continually seeing here. So I'm going to hold till we get to the questions and not prolong, but Lacey, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Harold. I really appreciate your comments because that resonates very well with the comments from the infrastructure coordinator from Utah, Hanson. And she was sharing with us yesterday the investment that Utah is putting in to help some of those communities that had been disadvantaged in the past, but do not have the resources to go after the grant. Like you're saying, there is no, like when you have a small, non-corporated town with 2 officials, they're not going to be looking at, grants.gov. And I think you are alluding to that need to support those communities so that they are competitive. But also you mentioned something that resonates also with Secretary Keogh from Arkansas, that she was mentioning the need for communities that sometimes have been developing infrastructure by themselves, but now have not been able to maintain it, how they can pool resources together so that they can become more competitive and also gain efficiency and more sustainable and resilient infrastructure. So I think that resonates very well with the conversation that was presented yesterday. So thank you. I just want to make a note. Jennifer Todd, she was our 4th panelist. She's a little bit under the weather, and she's not able to join us, but definitely she wishes that she could be here speaking to us, but we are wishing her to really quickly recover. So I'm going to actually go to our final panelist, Lacey Vaughn, and she has been having several roles at HNTV, and she including the Northern California Deputy Operations Manager. She has led efforts to diversify the pipeline of talent, as well as working with public sector transportation agencies to achieve equity outcomes on congestion pricing projects. Prior to joining HNTV, she was with the U.S. Government Accountability Officers, the famous GAO. Sometimes kind of create some reactions, but definitely you were one of the good people. Responsible for hiring and recruiting, meeting agency DEI, diversity, inclusion, and equity goals, and maintaining an inclusive work environment. Lacey?
Thank you so much I am so honored to be on this panel. And if you guys are not excited and have a ton of questions, I think we'll all have a good discussion. I am so invigorated just by what I've already heard and really want to actually springboard from what Harold said. And I think doing this work and at this moment in time, I have not felt more to be an optimist. And I hope that what I'm going to talk about today will kind of get you fired up as well, because Harold's right. I do not want things to change after next week. We, as you mentioned in my intro, I have deep policy background. And at this time, for those of us who have been doing this work, it is just a monumental moment to have policy in writing. We have a change in language that is going to change the definition of how we're going to make investments in the future. And when we talk about infrastructure investments, that is going to be long-lasting for generations. And as Harold said, we have an unprecedented amount of funding behind that. And this is really historical. And I think it's so key of what Harold said in terms of connecting those dots for people, connecting it to the policymakers, the people who are going to make decisions. I want to reiterate what this really means for people who've been doing this work, and this is all of you in this room. That shift, the shift of the environmental justice work where we've been working on prevention of mitigation, we're working on not having adverse effects in our projects. Here, with Justice 40, we're talking about proactively looking at having benefits in underserved, underrepresented communities. That is a huge shift in the paradigm of how we're talking about how we're going to deliver projects, how we're going to plan projects on here. I think that is a moment that we really have to take and look at how it's going to shift how we're going to start doing our work. You know, this work is a long road, as many of you know, and it's going to take time. We've been talking about this, it's just been a year since this has happened, and I know doing the work, working with clients, people are ready, when is this happening? When is this happening? And I just want to reflect on what we even just heard Dr. Scorza's presentation, where we're looking at the definition of equity, and now we're starting to see facilitated conversations about the outcomes of equity. That is why this session is just so important, where we shift from the education, the language, into where we're going to have about outcomes on here. That's this shift, this is the moment that we're in. So I want to share a few remarks, because I was invited to talk about sort of the public sector, but I feel like we have this opportunity with all of you in this room for maybe a little call of action of what we can do. Because we have also been seeing equity officers, D&I officers, but every single one of us can actually make equity as part of our job. And that's what we need to be doing. If we're going to start seeing equity really happen and a shift in projects, if we're going to start seeing that trickle down, well, it can't be just the one stakeholder, your one committee. We need to figure out how we make this as part of our whole life cycle of what we do. So I just want to share a few key things for you to be thinking about as you write your questions, as you think about more questions for our other distinguished panel on this, and what you're going to do tomorrow. We've been talking about diversifying our pipeline as one of the themes here on here. And you know, as we heard, we can start in schools. We can start by looking at, I think a lot of us, we have interns at universities and we try to diversify that. But I think what we really need to happen is that we do a further reach, because it's about, if you're already segmented into populations, we need to be part of STEM programs that reach elementary, grade school, high school students. Think about getting them as interns, because if we don't see people who look like us, if we don't know about the diversity of engineering, planning, and policy jobs out there, if you're isolated to a community where everybody has a job that is paying an hourly wage, you never know that you can dream bigger. You never know that there is more opportunities for there. And by the time we start doing recruiting at the college level, those students aren't there because they never saw that there was an opportunity. So I want you to think about STEM programs, interns, anybody you can reach out to really let them know that they're our future. That talent sometimes does not make it to the college level. So at H&TB, we're looking to do partnerships with also associations that can reach these diverse groups at an early age, because that's how we're going to start growing our pipeline, because those investments that we're talking about 30 years later, that's who's going to be using it on here. The other thing I want you to think about is what you can do about in your own organization, internal policies. As we've heard, we're starting to see local governments think about this. What does equity mean? We're starting to see state DOTs with equity policies, a statement on how they're going to guide, how they're going to do their work on here. And so even in your own organization, H&TB, one of the first things they did was revisit their SOPs and modify them to incorporate what, from an equity lens, how are we going to look at the planning process? How are we going to look at sales? What are our clients doing? You know, where are they at, and are we meeting them in terms of having equity and diversity on here? And once you change those policies, it doesn't end there. You got to think about training and awareness of your employees, because if you're at a construction firm, an architect firm, an engineering firm out here, and you change that, it doesn't end there. In order for you to advance equity on your projects, you've got to have that training. You have to have the tools to be able to enter into that conversation with your clients. You have to be able to ask the right questions on here. And the other, I think, perspective that we haven't really talked about that's also related to our pipeline that I want you to think about is how do we uplift those small businesses, what we've called our traditional DBEs, our small businesses, our underutilized, our underserved businesses that can create an advantage. How do we get them to be primes? Diana Mendez, who is our corporate president of inclusion, mobility, and equity, one of the things that she says all the time is it's not just that it gets built, it's about who builds it.
Yes.
I want you to think about that and what other programs we have. In Northern California, Caltrans, our DOT, has a mentor protege program that really tries to focus on getting small, disadvantaged businesses, underutilized businesses, those skills so that there can be a bigger pool when it comes to the table and who enters into transportation projects. So I think there's more we can do in that area. So those are things I want to think about. But I also, as a project manager, work with a lot of different local organizations in Northern California and some here in Southern California. And for those of you who are here in LA County, as you heard, LA has been far, far above the table. In 2018, LA Metro adopted an equity framework. And that's 2018, we're in 2022, and I think of that as the model, because what that framework did was to come up with 4 pillars on how to look at every single project. And from that, that's sort of what we're starting to ask around the country. People are asking, agencies are asking, what can we do? It becomes the guiding star for everybody in your organization to be thinking about, oh, how do I engage people? Where's that evaluation going to come from on here? How do I define and measure how this is going to look in thinking about outcomes, you know? And we're now starting to see more local organizations at the local level. I have all public sector clients thinking about this because we've really shared this model. And Therese McMillan, who is now the executive director in Northern California at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. This was something that she had brought to the LA Metro Board when she was the chief planning commission. You also may know her as a former acting FTA administrator. But I want to leave you with one thing that she said. I was at a Think Forum on Equity with her recently. And I know she's still thinking about this, but one thing I want to leave us with as we enter into the conversation, the thing that she said is we have to move at the speed of trust when we're starting to think about creating shared vision of equitable outcomes with our communities. So with that, I'm going to leave you something to think about.
Thank you, Lacey. Definitely quite a bit of food for thought, and I really appreciate it. So before I follow up on your comments, I just want to make sure that if you have a question, please, Anna, I think that we have a couple of questions out here so that we can start. But I think, Lacey, you made a comment. I really like the introductions that all three of you, because it builds on each other, but look at a different angle of it. And when you were speaking, it reminded me of an event that I was last week. And former Secretary of HUD, Sean Donovan, was speaking. And one of the things that we were talking about this issue of equity and investment and the concerns that you have shared about next week and is the clock turning back. And he was the former director of OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, so he knows how the federal government commit money. And what he said, and this kind of reflect, I don't know if our president's here, Maria Lehman, but something that she has been saying very forcefully is that it's now our responsibility to execute. You know, we ask and we say this money is necessary, but how we can execute efficiently. And what he said that is that if the money is committed, there is no way. It's very difficult to turn back the clock. Now, if it is not committed, there may be some leeway. But I think that, and Maria Lehman has been telling us over and over, it's 1 year, we need to show that we can do it. But you also were mentioning, again, LA County is doing great. Mark was actually in that event, and he showed a lot of the work that LA County and the Public Works is doing. But Chicago, we have Gia Biaggi, the Commissioner of Transportation for the City of Chicago. And she was looking at things. And what is interesting is to look at the different views on how different cities with their own idiosyncrasies are looking at this. She's looking at the heat maps. And she's looking at investment on how to ensure that any new project really address the disparities in those heat maps. So transportation deserts, you know, open space deserts, and how we should invest in there. And actually, one of another colleague of ours, Roger Millard, Secretary of Transportation for the Washington State, he was talking also the efforts that they are doing over there. But he brought a very interesting perspective, and it's like, a lot of times we hear the notion, it's like, oh, they don't want to do it when you're talking about capacitation and capacity building. And he said, like, sometimes they cannot do it. So in their programs, they are putting money for daycare, because daycare is one of the most challenging issues for people to be able to participate in a lot of programs, because they don't have the money, and then they have to leave their kids somewhere. So in their programs that they are using for capacity building, they are putting money for daycare so that individuals that participate are able to do that. Anna, do we have some questions? Okay, while we get those questions, I would like to ask a question. You know, the bipartisan law, I will ask this question and then go this. The bipartisan infrastructure law puts an emphasis on investing in communities of all size and means. This effort is further underscored by the Biden administration Justice 40, which you mentioned, Harold. Can you talk a little bit about Justice 40? What is it and how it's being interpreted? And let's emphasize that, how it's being interpreted and implemented. I would like to start first with you, Dr. Scorza, in Los Angeles.
Sure.
And then I can go to the other ones.
Thank you so much. So, you know, here in LA County, Justice 40 was used as a way to not only help educate our internal stakeholders, but to also make sure that we identified and created our own sort of version of heat maps as well, identified the neighborhoods that we wanted to target to strengthen, our investments and lift up specific projects. And so as we looked across the categories that I displayed on the screen here earlier, it was important for us to note what types of projects could fit within those categories, as well as identify where the needs might be. So if, for example, as I mentioned earlier, there was a need for tree canopy or increasing shade trees, we know exactly which communities to prioritize. And so in thinking about it, the way I would, imagine it is, obviously, allocating and targeting resources to the need, but then also making sure that that allocation and that resource targeting is sufficient to address the conditions that people are dealing with and facing in those neighborhoods.
Thank you. Harold, from your perspective, looking at the different places that you have been working and trying to bring together some of the initiatives that you have been leading, how do you see that they are actually interpreting and implementing Justice 40?
I think with the commitment that the president made, making sure that there is 40% of the resources, programs in these particular communities was more important. But when you look at the fact that infrastructure was a big deal, and especially when you look at the lead pipe replacement, that's an opportunity where you can get the Department of Labor engaged, of training people that could actually do a lot of that infrastructure work. We're seeing that in some spaces where, being able to engage, the communities and I think, as Lacey stated, even with the colleges and universities, as one of the things that we were able to do with establishing our federally qualified health center, the students at Texas Southern University came in and actually did the surveying. This is before Justice 40 or these tools in place. They were able to come in and do that, but the students at Howard University, the engineering students, came in and got us operational because, like I say, back in South Carolina, you put one thing on the table, they'll put something else in front of you. So we didn't have the opportunity. They were about to take the FQAC designation because we didn't have an actual location to go into. So the students actually came in and did this for us pro bono of getting us operational to where we went from 1 site to 11 sites. But this is where now Justice 40, the resources, as you stated, they're on the table to connect these dots. And this is what we're basically doing even with our institute, is being able to help, the community as well as local governments understand the process, because this is something that hasn't been done before, bringing everyone to the table. And that is what I think is the big glitch right now, is how does this work? And we see too in the statute that if you have some of those red state governors that refuse to do the right thing, there's a statute where local governments can apply themselves. It's not a thing where it's having to go directly to the states, but local governments are being able to apply for these resources across the board, not only DOT, but every agency there, going back to your point of even NSA and the Department of Education. Yeah. No one's thinking about these other agencies that play big roles of collaborating and connecting the dots and getting these projects implemented in these communities.
Thank you, Harold. And that brings us to, it's a similar question, but now that I have the cue cards from the audience, I would like to interject this question, and particularly for you, Lacey, since you are engineer in the private sector. The question relates to Justice 40, but from a different perspective. Is like, what do engineers need to learn to better implement Justice 40? From your perspective, what and again, we are talking about a room full of civil engineers, engineers in the infrastructure. How do engineers kind of help and learn to better implement Justice 40?
Well, I actually want to start with back to something that Harold had said when he first mentioned Justice 40, and I think this is the recognition that actually there's still a lot of people, when you say Justice 40, do not know what we're talking about. And that also might be within your own organization, And I think one of the things that H&TB did through our infrastructure and mobility equity group was to actually create sort of one-pagers, more tools that kind of gives you the fast facts for this. And that was sort of the training education piece that I was talking about earlier, but that sort of really helps sort of boil it down in terms of what does it mean, what does it say, what are the requirements, how much money in what areas. The thing too, when you start looking too about the infrastructure money, there you also see it's really not a lot of new programs. It's actually more investment in discretionary money. So a lot of the things that you probably already know on here. But when we talk about Justice 40 and and distributing the benefits, at least the 40%, and I want to actually emphasize this. This 40% should be the floor. I'm sorry. It just really needs to be, that is what the minimum investment that we're talking about on here. I think it really, for engineers to really sort of understand that, because I think, Fanny, you mentioned this in your intro, is when we have language that's kind of squishy out here, the squishy part about this is, the thing that I get asked a lot is, what does it mean to be a benefit? What's the benefit? And when you can start thinking about what a benefit looks like for that project, that community on here, and help your clients to use that, realize that, and really help them document that process, that where you can actually see what that benefit is. Because that's the squishiest part about this, and it's what's coming up. What's that benefit? And in some of the work that we do with some of our clients, the other thing that comes about benefit is what's going to be a meaningful benefit. So it's distributing those benefits, but when you're talking about then, if you're going to do the work of equity and think about outcomes, what's going to be meaningful for that particular project and that particular community? This is not a cookie cutter, one size fits all. And so thinking about Justice 40 and thinking about that, think about the squishiness, think about what's not clearly defined, and how do you help define that in a meaningful way?
Thank you, Lacey. And again, as you were talking, it's like, a lot of the people sitting here are in business. And in business, we hear a lot, what is the value proposition? And if you look at the question of the benefit is, what is the value proposition? What value are you bringing to the community that justify this investment? And I think this is, thank you, Lacey, for that comment. I have another question from the audience. And again, I will leave it up to you which one feel more would like to answer. But are there any samples from your experience of equity policy in infrastructure being codified into local state laws and ordinance, similar to what governs the protection of the environment in terms of building codes, zoning uses? Like we see a lot of local laws that are requiring, for example, LEED goal or whatever, or certain efficiency in energy reduction. Any thing that you would like to share?
Was it ready for me? Oh, okay.
But no, it's for anybody, but
yeah,
it looks like you want to answer it.
No. So it's interesting, right? Because in LA County, we've certainly been exploring it with regards to, for example, our land bank policies. So how are we working with, and even our capital and construction program. So we have a Rail to River project that we're building to help improve sustainability, but also connect communities to LA River. And then we have our housing policies as well, our housing and construction projects that we're engaged in, Project Home He, 1 and 2 here in Los Angeles through our collaboration with the state. But then there's also connecting it to things like our accessory dwelling unit policy. So it's, when I think about, I would avoid thinking about these laws, ordinance, or policies narrowly, right? Because they have an effect upon people and their lives. So, and thinking about, to Lacey's point, the outcomes of the experience of the impact that people are having with regards to these projects that we're engaged in, it's ultimately about understanding, at the end of the day, how are those communities going to benefit? What will their experiences be? And and how can we utilize these funds and these resources to improve life outcomes and close disparities in those communities. I'll add one additional point, given the last question. When we think about benefit in LA County, or at least in the work that we're doing with our infrastructure initiative, we're not just thinking about the benefits associated with where that project is physically located, right? Yes, that's an important benefit. But if we, for example, want to do a water project for us in Northern County, that's in Northern County up past Angeles Forest, in a huge sort of desert area, the people who might benefit could be down in Compton or down in Hawthorne as well, even though that water project is not located. It's 70, 80, 100 miles away. So when we think about benefit, to be equitable, it's really thinking, for example, about how we bring outcomes like clean water to communities that may have lacked access to clean water. We had an issue in Compton with our Sativa Water District where people were dealing with a lot of rust in their panes, in their pipes, brown water that was coming through their kitchen faucet and their toilets and their tubs, right? And so, a project in Northern County could benefit, even though it might be located somewhere else, could absolutely have positive benefits for others in another part of the community. And that's where the policy decisions come, right? It's in thinking about that entire picture, taking a step back and recognizing how what you're doing over here can have an effect upon a group over here, either intentionally or even unintentionally, right?
Thank you, Dr. Scorza. And again, what you're saying in terms of the decision-making, and we have been seeing that a lot of the agencies that are looking at bringing the concept of equity in how they allocate the funding and the resources, I think that goes kind of in line of what you're saying in looking at that. And Harold, one of the questions that we have kind of spun off of that, and from your experience, and how do we include more stakeholders in decision-making in this type of discussions of how to use the funding, where to locate the project, the benefits to the project, who benefits, who bear the difficulties and the challenges during construction?
Okay. I would say from experience, and I'll use industry, there was a chemical company in our community that they didn't realize that as I stated, the landfill not existing. And so they had their ethylene oxide tanks right next to the uncapped landfill that didn't exist. And it was a community, and a lot of what people actually being engaged with EPA and the investigators was able to help them identify a lot of what they didn't know even existed with their tanks where they were basically located. And out of that, there was this attitude, you stay on your side of the fence, we'll stay on our side of the fence. We worked in a project with, there was no transportation access in and out of the community, a rail line, and the CSX trains would sit sometimes an hour on the track, but there were at least 26 trains a day coming through there. Our local emergency planning commission didn't have a plan in case something happened. So the community and the chemical company partnered and created a live drill there, and showed that this was not a good ending scenario. I was actually the truck driver who drove the truck that was hit by the train. I died 7 times before the fire department really realized that they're not prepared for that. So out of that, looking at the community engagement, community involvement, listening to the people fear that. They fear putting the community at the table. Oh, you're anti-business, they're not anti, we just don't want to wake up with a chemical plant in my backyard while my child is on a sliding board and you've got somebody in a spacesuit trying to see where the hits of the contaminants are located. And I think we've had some good outcomes of good community participation, being engaged, and like I say, going back to these legacy sites, you have to have that because a lot of this just doesn't exist. And those that are in some of these state agencies and people that are going out to sites, if there's nothing in the record, how can they determine impact? And this is where having people that have been there, engaged into the process, can help move it along. It's not us against them.
Yeah.
If we get past that, you can expedite success a whole lot faster.
And I couldn't agree more, Harold. And I think sometimes that mentality of us versus them affects the outcome for everyone. And I think the idea is that we will make it run faster if everybody work together. Thank you for your answer. Lacey, you have quite a bit of experience on trying to increase the diversity of the workforce, and particularly nowadays, we know how important workforce is. We know, like, in all your companies, you are looking like crazy for talent and not finding. And sometimes, the perception is that some groups are left outside of the table, which should be in the table. And this question is very interesting in perspective that how do we get the people that are tired of hearing about JEDI, justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion? How do you get those people on board? How do you try, again, go back to what Harold's saying, we, instead of us that are supporting and, rallying for JEDI, and the people that say, wait a second, what happens there? What are some of the strategies that you have seen you have utilized or you have seen in your experience that bring that we together?
So is this about our workforce, and how do we kind of actually have a more diverse workforce on here? And I work at a firm that has initials of I don't know how many other people here. It's traditionally a white male-dominated field on here. And when you think about that and you think about going into that and working for somebody, as a woman who is not white or male, that doesn't sound like something that you want to go in, because you think about it, it's going to be hard. You're going to have a hard road. Who's going to help you? Who's going to be your mentor, your ally? I think this is something that you talked about early on in your presentation of here. And so you've got to do more in terms of trying to reach them. And I think what I'm really getting at is part of what I left you with it's about trust. You have to sort of build that trust when we're talking about working with communities. You kind of have to do the same thing as an organization to change that, because somebody's going to look and you're going to want to recruit, and what's that promise? You come here and they're going to feel, this is just historically, if you've always been that person who is the checkbox, the number to make you say, oh, you just want to get in there. What are you doing in terms of who you are as an organization for your value system? Are you involved in the community? Do they see you there? Do you have investments actually in the community? Is your organization volunteering to do a broader outreach? And it's not just your traditional, let's go to this school and try to get people. Are you part of that fabric of a community? That's how you're going to start to build trust, and that represents the value system of your organization. You as an organization, if you can do that and say that, you're really showing somebody that when you come here, you're not part of an initiative. You're part of an organization that actually values diversity. And when you come and become an engineer here, we're not just saying we have a diverse candidate in here. We actually care about the thoughts, the project solutions that you have. That's the competitive advantage. And when we can start showing people that you coming here has value, it has a competitive advantage, and we incorporate that into that framework of here. So it's not an easy, hey, do this. It really is really looking inside and out and thinking about how your organization's structured. Do you have a policy in place? And does that policy filter down to recruiting, how you do your work, how you incorporate voices into a meeting. Are you taking and giving opportunities to these candidates to go to actually grow and be successful? Because you can't just bring them in and check that box, because they will leave. And what are you doing to retain them to create value for your organization?
Thank you, Lacey. I think there was a statement that you made there in terms of the voices. And I think it goes back to that fundamental of listening and respect. To listen.
I was wanting to piggyback off of that
No,
one.
no, please, go ahead. Yeah.
Please don't take my Mickey ears away
No,
from me.
no. I'm just filling out air, so you can go.
But it was going back to that point that she just mentioned that I just thought about it, was the stakeholder process with communities.
Yes.
And when the communities actually, when you empower them, it's kind of like, I'll give you two examples here in California. And one is a tribal, one is a Hispanic farm worker. Being able to get them on board and getting their state representatives behind them, because it's kind of like we forget who's in charge. We kind of think that they're in charge. But empowering them, they were able to get $55 million in to address their issues in the community, which enabled the local government to say, hey, they were ready to come to the table. Now, for a long time, they would not talk to them, wouldn't work with them. But when they were able to go out and bring those kinds of resources back to the table, now they're a viable stakeholder at the table. And I think a lot of people are starting to see and understand that communities can go out and get resources like you're looking for local governments. Local governments can't hit the foundations that are looking, especially after George Floyd and what took place that woke up the foundation world and all the philanthropic folks that are out there trying to invest in social justice now. So there's an appetite to where if you marry this move with what the administration has put together, we can connect those dots and make the differences within the communities following your model.
Yeah. I think both what Lacey and Harold have just shared is really essential. It's really critical, right? Because part of what we're talking about here is how sometimes people see this as a zero-sum game, right? Yeah. If I win, you lose. If you lose, I win. And that zero-sum game can drive our ability to be sort of, can drive sort of differences between different groups. But I think to the question that was asked, one of the, and this, people ask this question all the time, like, what do I do? How do I get past those who might be resistant? And what I often find in this work is that there's typically four types of people who do this sort of work or that you engage in your workplace or in multiple spaces. One is the early adopter. The other is sort of the willing tester, somebody who's willing to go along and figure it out. The third one is someone who's just, colorblind. I don't see it. It doesn't matter. I don't see race. I don't really care. And then the fourth one's just the active resistor, someone who's like, no, screw you. I'm not doing this. Leave it alone. Don't touch it. And what I typically find unites people across those four groups is focusing on common and universal values. So if, for example, we want to make sure that all children can thrive and have access to green space, most people can agree with that, right? Most people can agree with kids being able to go play safely in a park in their neighborhood. Most people can agree with, people being able to have a decent meal, right? The things that, what I think has been really helpful is to find the things that you agree upon and start from there. Most people agree, whether or not you're on the red or on the blue side or the green or the purple side, right? Yeah, wherever you might be, most people want to see businesses thrive. They want small business owners to be able to do well. So I think identifying those places for common and universal values opens up the opportunity, even if you don't talk about race, even if you're not talking about equity, making sure your business community can do well. And sometimes the language we use has to be presented in a way, while it censures equity, may not always, set people off and set them on opposite sides of the conversation right away. So I think what I often find is that it's important for us to get away from zero-sum conversations. But then there are also very specific occasions where you do have to take the issues of race and or gender and or ableism head on, right? You all build curb cuts, or many of you know what the importance of curb cuts are, especially given the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? We don't ignore the fact that you need a curb cut to help make sure somebody who has a disability can get onto the sidewalk. But we also can lift up and elevate the fact that that curb cut has now made it possible for that cyclist to get safely on that sidewalk, has now made it possible for those parents to safely push their children up onto the sidewalk, has now made it possible for the older adult to safely push their basket from the grocery store up onto that sidewalk, right? There are ways that we can talk about and do this work such that it helps us achieve equity, but we're not always sort of throwing it in people's face, but when it's time to really stand for what it means, you're able to do so in those moments as well.
Thank you.
Paid for by Dr. Scorza.
Thank you, Dr. Scorza. Again, going back to those basic principles of common values and the basic values, and again, going back to Lacey about listening, respect. And I think this is one that you have to do it. And it's true. People see that everybody deserves, a place for the kids to play and to have a meal. So, and I would like to shift a little bit, but actually I was going to say to Harold that you seem to have a crystal ball because this question is like related to what you were talking. So it's about, and this will go to you particularly, Dr. Scorza. We have here a group of experts and professionals in the infrastructure domain. And the question is, how can we build for this infrastructure expert and professional the ability to work with the communities in the grant writing and capacity building in disadvantaged community so that they can be successful? And the reason why I think asking the question specifically to you, because there is always that dance between the private and the public sector. Where can they work together? How much the private sector should go and help and don't disqualify a community? And you, from your perspective in LA County, how do you think the professionals that are here, particularly from the private sector, can help their communities, because maybe their own communities or other communities, to be competitive and build that capacity to write those grants?
Yeah, I'll try and be brief. Prior to my time in LA County, I founded and started a nonprofit organization for over 14 years. And we created a greening plan for the cities of Inglewood and our neighboring unincorporated area of Lenox. And one of the things that we did in partnering with both the city but also with the county at the time was we engaged in this entirely community-led design charrette process, and we looked at specific areas of import. So we looked at water, transportation, air quality, housing, open space, so urban agriculture and green space opportunities, and then also specifically building out a component around community engagement in our greening plan. And what that did was it helped us drive community voice and leadership in a way that co-powered them, not empowered, but co-powered, right? It was the city and our county leaders alongside community members who were actually leading the design charrette process and helping to inform the outcomes that were experienced, the outcomes that they wanted to experience. Through sort of an incorporation of these policies and or practices or even ideas in the city's and the county's general plan and elements. I say that to say that, when we're thinking about community, it is sometimes it frankly can be a really daunting and even scary thing to consider how to incorporate folk. But when communities themselves are at the forefront, where they're moved from the periphery to the center of the conversation, when they're moved out of being marginalized to being central in the conversation, it's going to take time, it's going to take a lot of patience, but the product always, I'm certain about it, the product almost always ends up being so much better than what it was like if you just hired a firm, said, let's go do a community engagement process, you held a couple of workshops, you ran around in the community, said you got people's voice, and then you did what the city leaders or community leaders or civic leaders asked you to do anyway, right? They really just wanted you to go check the box. When we center voice from community through participatory action research projects, through the use of co-powered design charrette efforts, through a whole host of and series, through participatory mapping activities, you will see products that help to make the infrastructure projects that we're aiming to achieve that much better. And so those are some of the tools that we can use to help drive that co-powering as well. I know, Harold.
And and I will piggyback. Hand me the phone. Okay. Partnerships and charrettes is a big key piece to this because every community, especially when you look at some of the disadvantaged, they can't imagine or vision, something that we're talking about without seeing it in this design phase. And this is where the Department of Energy, with their the grant that they have for design charrettes, and every community is not going to get a grant, which is why you have a lot of the colleges and universities who could use this as like laboratories of going in and working with the communities. Students have a great way of connecting with folks within the communities and hearing their voices. Only thing they want to do is be a part of the process. But at the end of the day, a lot of what local governments are looking for and what the communities are looking for are the exact same thing, but they're just saying it differently. But when you put that and allow them to go through that charrette process and planning process, they see it, they start reimagining things. And, there's a couple of places where we've seen these trails that folks are trying to create, I forgot the name of it, but the historic
Districts?
no, it's, God almighty. So you took my Mickey ears from me.
You can
But-
still earn them back.
Yeah.
They could come back.
The historic cultural trails that we saw in some spaces, like in Florida, where there was Jesse Owens, Satchel Paige, and there were a couple of other sports figures that came through this particular town that folks at the local level didn't know, but the community started talking and bringing out pictures, and it was like, oh my God, we have, this cultural tourism that we can impart here, and just that engagement and historical value and knowledge had the planners at that point saying, hey, we could do this because where we were planning to build this here, and you just should have seen the synergy in the room. And this is why it's so important to bring those folks to the table, because many of your planners and city managers, they don't and have not been raised in those communities. There's a lot of value and history that we miss that I've seen in a lot of the spaces that are coming to the table, and is really helping the planning process. So I agree with you, and if we could just do that, it would make it so much easier for everyone.
And let me say one final thing. Pay people in community to be at the table. Don't expect them to show up, come to your meetings, and not compensate them for their time. They deserve to be paid at least a fair and decent wage, an hourly rate. So set money aside, just like we get paid to go out and do the work. Their time needs to be honored and compensated as well.
Thank
I just
you.
want to add one thing, because
Lacey?
I was going to just reiterate that, if we want people to show up, particularly if you're also working with community-based organizations, their time is money. But the other thing that you mentioned about planners not being in the community, for those planners, your project managers out here, we are so used to a schedule. What we heard today about actually having real engagement, that takes time. That's going to probably take more time than you actually think, because you don't really know what direction it's going to. If we did, why are we doing this process? We're going to get a mediocre product. If we're really going to have engagement, it's going to take time and it's going to cost money, but that's the value you end up getting out of it.
Thank you so much. I know that we are out of time, but I do want to give you 1 minute, to say parting words. Take home. What do you want the audience to take home from this conversation? Lacey?
I think I just said that, but if I were to ask you, I am really, the thing that gets me excited and the thing that gets me work is actually working with youth and young people. So if I ask you to do anything, get engaged with the youth, share with them that they could actually work on a project in their community and make a difference and see something being built, and they can build it.
Thank you. Harold?
Okay. Look at the best example practices that are out there, and I think one that this group could look at is the Center for Excellence that Secretary Buttigieg has, that would give you a pretty good template to even establish what you're doing there in LA County, to be able to use that to implement their projects and their work. And also get talk to your local government about creating oversight committees. And this is a way to look at the covered program list to do exactly, since I don't have time, to follow what they're doing in LA County. That's the exact same thing, having the oversight to pull those cabinet heads together to look at the programs, prioritize, and draw the federal funding down to implement their projects. So just those two things.
Thank you. Dr.
Yeah,
Scorza?
and we didn't get into it too much, but you're an engineer, so use data, right? Data is such an incredibly powerful tool to maintain accountability. So data and reporting are incredibly important assets. We're doing a lot of geospatial mapping in LA to help identify areas and communities of need. So I would encourage you all to explore, if you've not already doing this, many of you probably are, but explore the use of GIS to help advance racial equity. Explore the use of data, dashboarding, scorecarding, reporting to track your progress over time and be transparent about what you're actually getting done or not getting done, so that way you can pivot when the thing that you thought you were going to achieve does not occur, when it's not working, right? We don't have to be perfect. This is a journey. We don't have to solve it overnight, but data can help drive solutions over time.
Thank you. And now I would like to give a thanks to our panelists for wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for listening, and I hope that you continue the conversation. There is a lot more activity still happening, so please continue to enjoy the convention. Thank you.
That was fun. That was so much fun. Can't wait